Hi there, welcome back to the archive. So I'm going to do one more on the section from Paula Giddings, When and Where I Enter, the impacts of Black women on race and sex in America. So I'm going to talk about the section on slavery of Africans. So before Africans were stolen and kidnapped to America, uh, white people were enslaving themselves. You have to remember that, right? In Europe, they were doing that, and then they brought that to quote unquote the New World. So they were enslaving themselves before they had contact with us. It looked like serfs, it looks like servants, but there were enslaved people in Europe, and then again, like I said, when it came to the Americas. And so they were enslaving themselves. Often, white women would be their servants, right? And so some were also even sold to Native Americans as indentured slaves, and then women, even white women, were sexually exploited as well too. So the first Africans arrived in Virginia in 1619. So that would be considered the 17th century. So 1619. If you remember, I was saying in the future I'm going to share Njinga's story. This is around the same time, right? Because the Portuguese arrived in Angola around 1626. 1619, so this is even earlier. At the height of her reign was 1640s. Yeah, so they came even earlier. They arrived to Angola even earlier. I'm still thinking about, I don't know, I'm really sitting with this because based on this, it took like 8 years for the Portuguese to convert the African Ndongos into Catholics. That's all it took was 8 years. And it wasn't until Nzinga came, so they were like, what are you doing? But the first Africans arrived in Virginia in 1619. They were servants for colonial administrators and they worked alongside white servants. One of the first Africans in America, her name was Isabel Williams, and it said that she was married to a man named Anthony, and they had a son named William. And William is apparently the first African baby to be born on American soil in 1924. So I just, wait, what? No. 1619 is when they arrived. Was it 1624? I'm not sure. The date, I think I wrote the date wrong. But either way, it said that her child was the first child to be born in the Americas. And so I'm saying a lot. They're not recorded in the book, and so we believe that she was a freed woman because there's no, she was never, her and Anthony were not listed as, they were not listed as servants in the official registry of the colony at the time, and so Isabel and William were probably freed. So the need for free labor changed this. So in 1625, there was only 23 Africans, just 23 Africans, right? In 1625. And mind you, they came in 1619. And so by 1640, there were about 300 enslaved Africans. So in 1640, John Punch, who was a black servant, and two white servants tried to escape. They tried to revolt. They said, we're not doing this. They got caught. The white men were given 4 extra years of service, and John Punch was assigned for the time of his natural life as a slave here and elsewhere. So that became the idea of enslaving folks for their lifetimes. It started with John Punch, right? Even though he tried to escape with two other white men, the white men weren't enslaved for life. They just got additional 4 extra years, right? So the white man got 4 extra years. John, the black man, was extended for the duration of his natural life. As long as you're alive, you will be enslaved and indebted to us. So that became the trend of enslaving Africans for life. And so Massachusetts, uh, yeah. So, anyways, he was the first to recognize Massachusetts was the first to recognize slavery into statute. The first victim of this was actually a white man, though, because he had hit his slave master. And so in 1641, both black and white servants were branded, right? Branding was when they would get the, like they would do with the animals, right? Either the year this is a property of, and then you would be branded. So both black and white servants were branded. That started in, what did I say? That started in 1641. By 1661, fornication with black men or women was seen as unchristian, right? So all of a sudden, the Bible said that fornication with black people is a sin. Because remember, they did change the Bible for the enslaved people, right? I hope you know that. Black people, enslaved Africans, had a different version of the Bible. They took out all the rebellion and all the revolts, and because they didn't want black people reading about that and getting any ideas, so black people had a different version of a Bible. But at this time, fornication with black people was seen as unchristian, and it carried a greater fine than interracial liaisons, right? Children born to black women, no matter who the father was, became inherently a slave, regardless of whether the man was white or black. As long as a black woman had a child, the child that was born from her was automatically seen as a slave. And so, white women were not immune to these changes. They also suffered. White servants who had a child with their master got 2 more years of service because the idea was like, oh, now women are trying to trap men, right? They're trying to trap their masters. And so even white women who had kids with their masters got, how many years did I say? 2 or 4 more years. They got 2 more years of service, right? If they had a child with a black man, that was even worse. They were fined 15 pounds. And if they didn't pay this, they were then basically sold off um, to the church for 5 years. So having children with black men, especially, was not a great thing. It would get you fined and or sent out of the colony. If white women married any black or native men, they were banished from the colony forever. So basically, white men would marry white women to their enslaved Africans so that the white women could become slaves. So essentially, black people were chattel. Um, White men could impregnate black women with impunity, and she alone could give birth to a slave, right? And so black people became the primary labor force in the context of the church, capitalism, and the psychological needs of white men, is what Paula says here. So slavery was harsh, right? We know that there was physical abuse, there was dismemberment, there was torture, but black people did fight back, contrary to what we see and here it's like, oh, well, it's because the Quakers freed them. And like, absolutely, the Quakers were pivotal. But black people were also resisting, right? They did resist. Women would sometimes poison their masters as a form of resistance in the 18th century using herbs and stuff that they had learned from back home in Africa. Some of the slaves would burn their masters' homes, right? As another form of resistance. Oftentimes they would be killed in return, right? They would be hanged, they would be burned, but they still tried. So they would burn it, the homes. They would damage and sabotage machinery. They would sabotage crops, like harvest time. They would sabotage the crops so they couldn't make as much money. Women also withheld their reproductive labor. Oh, you want my child, so then you have more free labor. Absolutely not. So they would either have abortions or, again, use traditional herbs to uh, prevent pregnancy. So birth control, they would have different ways of controlling that, and or just have abortions. So they would withhold their reproductive labor as a form of punishment, right? If I can't give you a child, then you can't make money off of my child. And so it was basically expected that everybody obey the patriarchal head of the household, right? Everybody. The white man's wife, his children, and all of the enslaved people. So basically, when they want to make America great again, that's usually what they miss. They miss that time where everybody looked up to the white man as the patriarchal head of household, um, where there was a hierarchy and the white man was on top. They're still on top, right? But um, so basically, yeah, the people said that any changes would lead to the downfall of slavery and the family unit, right? Oh, if you change this, then everything is going to crumble. We hear it now. Feminists are ruining the family unit. It's the same panic. It's always been there since it's always been there. It's nothing new, right? Making women equal to men is the end of the family unit. The same thing will happen then. Changing and making any changes would just make slavery crumble. And so it's also important to know that some of the earliest white feminists, Angela and Sarah Grimke, I believe their names are, they were raised in slaveholding households. Um, and it's also important to know that white women also owned slaves, right? Sometimes we forget and think that like it was only men, but white women did own slaves as well too. If their husbands died, for instance, sometimes he left them slaves. Um, so it's important to remember that white women also did own slaves. Paula also talks about within black communities, within the black enslaved Africans, black mothers and fathers would often raise their children really harshly to teach them survival skills, right? And so she was saying there wasn't a lot of room for compassion because any sort of compassion to the child was seen as a form of weakness and they couldn't afford weakness, right? Our children cannot be weak because you need to survive this. And so one example she shares of Sojourner Truth, I'm going to get into Sojourner Truth 1 second. Like I said, I've been thinking about future episodes. So one of the future episodes, I'm going to talk about Sojourner Truth. Ain't I a Woman? We'll get into her story in a little bit. But here, what I want to share is that Sojourner Truth, for instance, was said that she would whip her child when it cried for food, right? When her child cried for bread, she would whip the child because she wanted to teach her child that it should not want what more than it needed, right? And that often became slave. There's a psychologist that talks about this phenomenon now. I don't remember what it is. 1 second. Yeah, Dr. Joy Degree Leary talks about the post-traumatic slave syndrome, how this is still shows up today, right? Where Black mothers specifically are really, really hard on their children, and they do that as a form of love to protect their child. And she traces it back to slavery. And this is the thing, right? When my child cries out of hunger, I whip my child A, to keep it silent so we don't get in trouble, and B, to teach the child to not be entitled, right? And so, Sojourner Truth, that's an example where Black grandmothers, Black mothers would often be really, really hard on their children as a way to teach them obedience, right? You need to learn obedience so you don't die, so you're not killed. You cannot be weak, otherwise you will be destroyed. And so that we see the remnants of that today, right? Black mothers, I think Dr. Joy talks about like how a child will do something really great and the mom doesn't want to celebrate it because she doesn't want to make the child's head too big, right? Those are kind of the things that we see still today, the remnants of it. And so those are some of the dynamics. Another one that was interesting was even within the Black community, the Black enslaved Africans, they would also have codes for conduct, right? So if somebody did something that was out of pocket, they would play the banjo on them, is what it was called. And so to play the banjo on somebody would basically to be like to write a diss track. That's what would be the equivalent today, right? They would write a diss track. They would write a song to shame the person into submission, right? You act it out. We are gonna play this banjo to shame you. Get your act together. And so those are some of the dynamics. That's what I wanted to talk about a little bit about the conditions, the resistance, and what life was like on some plantations in the antebellum South of the United States. And so all of this came from Paula Giddings, like I said, When and Where I Enter. So I am going to end it there for today. I'll be back to share more on the warrior queens as well as Sojourner Truth. Sojourner Truth. Okay? So until next time, in solidarity.